The two most important parts of your bow are your riser and your limbs. They're also the most expensive parts. Now, an expensive riser has some fairly obvious differences to a cheap riser, but limbs generally look the same. So what's the difference? In fact, there are quite a few things which you should know about limbs, so we'll be covering quite a bit of information in this video, and hopefully we'll answer some of the most common questions when it comes to buying limbs. Firstly, let's talk about what limbs actually do. While the riser acts as a central hub, the limbs do the work. When the string is drawn, the limbs flex, storing potential energy. When released, the limbs snap back and the energy is transferred into launching the arrow. A misconception is that the power comes from the string, but while a string does have an effect, the power basically comes from the limbs. The limbs achieve this through its use of layers of different materials. Traditionally, bows use wood, horn, and sinew. Modern limbs use fiberglass, wood, carbon, and synthetic foam. Takedown bows can easily remove their limbs, allowing for easier storage and replacement. Most risers and limbs use International Limb Fitting, or ILF, which means that most risers are compatible with most limbs. Cheaper takedown bows tend to use their own proprietary limb fitting systems, so you can't swap out a Samick Sage limbs with an ILF limb set, for example. There are a couple of notable examples on the high end as well. The Hoyt Formula series uses its own limb systems. So you have to basically buy Formula limbs for a Hoyt Formula bow. Now you can get some adapters, but generally speaking it's much easier to go with the simplest option, which are the Formula and Formula limbs, or just get a recurve bow that uses IF fittings. Let's go on to differences. The most important thing to consider when buying limbs is poundage. Poundage refers to the draw weight of the bow measured in pounds, which is how heavy the bow is when at full draw. The heavier the bow, the more powerful it is. Now, how much poundage you get depends on what you're getting the bow for. If you're a beginner, it's recommended that you get somewhere between 20 to 30 pounds. If you're shooting competition, people tend to use 40 to 50 pounds. And if you're hunting, well, that can be 40 pounds to 60 or even 70 pounds. Again, this varies greatly with gender as well as fitness, and it will change over time. You may find that you will grow in strength, so you will get higher poundage limbs down the track. Or you might find that heavy limbs might be too strong for you, and you might want to go down to weaker limbs. A couple of notes about draw weight. The actual figure you see printed on the limbs assumes two things. The first is it assumes a standard draw length of 28 inches. Now, if your draw length is longer, it's going to be heavier than the printed draw weight. Likewise, if it's shorter, it's going to be a bit lighter than the printed draw length. For example, these are 40-pound limbs as rated for a 28-inch draw. Now, my draw length is closer to around 26 inches, so I'm not actually pulling 40 pounds on my fingers. The second baseline is that a limb's poundage is based on a 68-inch bow, unless otherwise specified. If a limb is used for a shorter bow, then it will have a higher effective poundage. Some limbs will list these separate lengths. For example, on these limbs, you can see it's 40 pound for a 68-inch bow, but it's 42 pounds for a 66-inch bow. And likewise, if you put these limbs on a longer riser and you get a 70-inch bow, this will probably be around 38 pounds. On that note, let's talk about limb lengths. When you buy limbs, you have to choose how long the limbs are. For an Olympic style target recurve, the most common length is 6 to 8 inches. Now, that's actually not how long the limbs are, but it's how long the bow is in total with the riser and the limbs. The next part is a bit complex. The lengths listed for a limb assume a 25-inch riser, which is the most common size. Limbs usually come in 66 inch, 68 inch and 70 inch, and that will be the length of the bow overall when paired with a 25 inch riser. However, you can get different size risers. The most common variations are 23 inch and 27 inch, although you can get ones in between or longer ones. Now, if you put 68 inch limbs on a 27 inch riser, you get a 70 inch bow because there's extra 2 inches. Likewise, if you put 70 inch limbs on a 23 inch riser, you get 68 inches for a bow. Basically, you can have different combinations of short, medium and long limbs with short, medium and long risers. The most common combination is medium limbs with a medium riser, which makes your standard 68 inch bow. Although if you need that extra length, you can combine long limbs of long riser or medium limbs of long riser, depending on how much length you want. The combination makes a difference. Using shorter limbs will give your bow a bit more punch, which means the arrows will come out a bit quicker. However, it makes it easier to stack. What that means is, when you get past a certain point, you go beyond what the limb is rated for. Now that isn't bad and that isn't dangerous. What it means is that it becomes dramatically more difficult once you reach this point. That's because the energy in the limbs isn't linear based on draw length. Once you get past that point, it makes it more difficult to be consistent with your release. Longer limbs, on the other hand, are less efficient, so they won't launch the arrow as quickly. So if you have a short draw length, you shouldn't be using longer limbs because it's just not efficient. You may as well use shorter limbs. Which bow length you use depends on your draw length, although some charts will draw an estimate based on your height. Most people will use 68 inch bows. Note that this is most relevant to a full-size target bow. If you're shooting a youth bow or traditional bow or a hunting bow, your limbs will probably be shorter. Whew, okay, that's a lot to take in. The last part covers the differences between cheap and expensive limbs, and this is actually the easiest part to explain. Cheap limbs are made from fiberglass with a wood core, whereas more expensive limbs are made from materials like carbon and synthetic foams. The price difference is astronomical. You're looking at, say, $200 for cheap limbs and $800 and $1,000 for more expensive limbs. There are a couple of big advantages to using expensive carbon limbs. The first one is that it's more linear. I said before that when you draw a bow back, the energy in the bow isn't linear. It tends to stack. Now for a cheap wooden limb set, it tends to stack a lot sooner. So when you come back in, it gets harder at this point. With a carbon limb set, it's a bit more linear. So when you come in, it's smoother, it's more consistent. So even with a bit of variation, it won't punish you as badly than with a wooden limb. The second advantage is that carbon limbs are more efficient. If you get 30-pound wood limbs and 30-pound carbon limbs, the carbon limbs will launch the arrow with high velocity. This efficiency makes carbon limbs the prime choice for competitive shooting. That said, for beginner archers, the difference in limb performance isn't as important. With the focus for beginner being on form rather than accuracy, it's okay to use cheap limbs to begin with. Additionally, as a beginner, you may end up going through multiple sets of limbs as you increase your draw weight. Now, if you're looking for more limbs, you can perhaps borrow old limbs of somebody else. Some stores will offer a limb trading service where you can trade in your old limbs for new ones of a higher draw weight, of the same price range, even if it's a different brand. But if you have to buy new limbs each time, you may want to consider spreading your budget out, so you don't buy like $1,000 Hoyt or Win limbs for every single draw weight. So you might go cheap limbs until you're happy with your final weight, and then you spend big on that one. But take it from me, the carbon limbs will give much better performance, and they will contribute to tighter groups. By the way, if you're shooting the target style recurves, you don't need to get matching risers and matching limbs. Like, you don't need a SF Axiom riser with SF Axiom limbs. You can mix and match, it's completely fine. Everyone does it. You could put Hoyt limbs on the Winnow bow. As sacrilegious as it might sound, you can do that. I mean, it's not like you're wearing one Nike shoe and one Adidas shoe. Whew. So, that should cover most questions about limbs. Since the limbs do the work of the bow, they're very important, and buying good limbs will allow you to perform better. However, they also are an expensive investment, so if you don't need top tier limbs, you don't have to pay an arm and a leg for them. Anyway, hope that was helpful. Thanks for watching. This is NUSensei. Like this video, subscribe for more archery stuff, and I'll see you next time.